The wind was dry and sharp as the small shuttle touched the ground of Dustfall Colony, and the air was filled with red dust that danced like spirits in the sunlight. And the people of the colony stood in silence as they watched the figure step out of the ship, and his robe was black and simple, with a silver chain around his neck, and his hands were calm as he held a small book to his chest, and he looked up at the sky like he was listening to something far away. He was not a soldier, and he was not a traitor, and he had no weapons, and yet no one dared to stop him as he walked toward the old shrine at the edge of the colony. And the shrine had been closed for many cycles, and its stones were cracked, and its symbols long faded, and the alien people called it a cursed place where bad dreams slept and old gods whispered in broken tongues. The human priest did not fear the shrine, and he did not speak as he placed his hand on the old wooden door, and it opened with a soft creak that echoed across the dusty ground, and some of the aliens turned away, and others whispered to each other, and none stepped forward to greet him, and none offered him water or shade. Welcome among them was a young alien girl with pale skin and large glowing eyes, and she stood in the back, watching the priest with wide eyes, and she had never seen a human before. And she had never seen anyone walk into the shrine and not fall to their knees in fear or sickness or madness, and something about him made her heart beat faster and her fingers tighten around the crystal stone she carried in her pocket inside the shrine. The air was cold and quiet, and the priest knelt before a broken altar and opened his book and began to whisper soft words in a language not known to the colony, and his voice was calm and steady, and the shadows in the corners seemed to pull back, and the cracked floor began to glow faintly with a light that pulsed with each word he spoke. Outside the sun dipped lower, and the red sky darkened, and the alien people closed their doors and locked their windows, and only the girl stayed near the shrine, hiding behind a broken pillar as she watched the strange human pray to something unseen and unknown that night. The wind grew stronger, and a loud crack woke the people as one of the colony towers shorted out with a burst of light, and the engineers could not explain it, and said the core had not failed in over 50 years, and the same night the sick boy in the healer's tent sat up and asked for water, and his fever was gone, and his breathing was strong again, and the healers looked at each other in silence and said nothing. The next day more strange things happened, as the old machines that had been dead for years suddenly started to hum again, and the birds that never came near the colony began to circle sky above the shrine, and a tree that had withered long ago now had green buds growing on its branches, and the people began to whisper again, and this time their words were sharper and full of fear. The alien girl returned to the shrine with shaking hands and stepped inside without asking, and found the priest sitting still with his book open and his eyes closed, and she asked him if he was doing this, and he opened his eyes and said he only prayed, and she said the shrine was not safe, and the book he held was forbidden and cursed, and he looked at her with a calm face and asked if it frightened her, and she said yes. Then she asked him a question that made his hands stop moving and his lips freeze, and she asked him why he wore the mark on his neck and why the symbol matched the old ones on the wall of the shrine, and he looked down at the chain he wore and slowly closed the book and said nothing for a long time. A noise like thunder rolled across the sky, though no storm was near, and the girl took step back, and her eyes were wide, and she whispered a name not spoken in many generations, and the name meant cursed soul in her tongue, and she said her mother once told her stories of a man with that mark, and how he walked among gods and burned cities with only his voice, and how he brought peace and death. In the same breath the priest stood and walked toward the altar and placed the book down with care, and the stone beneath it lit up with a soft white glow, and the symbols around the room began to shine one by one like stars waking up, and the girl turned and ran out of the shrine, and did not stop until she reached her home, where her parents looked at her and asked what was wrong, and she could only say one thing again, and again, he has come, he has come. He has come. The night fell heavy on Dustfall Colony, and the sky above looked like dark glass covered in cracks, and stars flickered weakly, as if afraid to shine too bright, and the wind carried no sound except for the distant creaks of metal towers swaying, and the faint whisper of sand brushing across stone, and inside the shrine the priest sat in silence with his hands resting on the book that now refused to close in its pages. pulsed with a soft light like a heartbeat made of ink and fire. The alien girl who had seen him the day before lay in her small room staring at the ceiling, and her fingers clutched the crystal stone tightly as her mind replayed the way the symbols lit up when the priest touched the altar and how the wind had screamed through the walls. Without shaking a single leaf, and she remembered the name that had fallen from her lips like water breaking through old stone, and she whispered it again and again, hoping it would lose its power, but each time it made the room colder. She rose quietly and slipped outside, moving like a shadow between empty homes and silent machines, and the colony lights flickered as she passed, and the air around her felt different, thicker, older, and her feet moved without thought, as if something called her back to the shrine. And when she reached the gate, she saw it was already open, and the wind pushed it slowly back and forth with a soft groan inside the shrine. The priest sat with his eyes open, staring into nothing, and he spoke in a voice low and steady. But the words were not his own, and the language was twisted and strange like stone grinding against glass, and the girl stood at the edge of the doorway, frozen and unable to move as the sound wrapped around her like chains made of air and light. And then he stopped and looked at her. She asked him why he prayed in a language older than her people, and he smiled gently and said it. It's the only way the book would listen, and she stepped closer and saw that his eyes no longer looked human but held tiny patterns moving like tides inside them, and she asked him what he truly was, and he did not answer right away, and instead placed the book on the floor and pushed it toward her. She knelt and looked down and saw that the words had changed again, and now they were written in her own language, though the ink still shimmered like fresh oil, and the letters danced and shifted, and she could barely read the sentence that seemed to float above the page, and it said, "He who prays with both light and shadow shall open the sealed sky and let the truth fall like fire." Her hands began to tremble, and she pulled back quickly, but the words burned into her mind and refused to fade, and she looked up at the priest and asked him if he had come to destroy them, and he shook his head and said he had come only to find peace. But peace had never been his to hold, and the girl asked why the machines around the colony had started working again, and why the old stone tree had come to life. The priest said he did not mean for it to happen, but when he speaks, the world listens, and sometimes the world remembers, and that memory is not always kind. And she asked what he meant, but he only stood and walked toward the back of the shrine, where a cracked wall held carvings worn smooth by time, and he brushed away the dust and revealed a symbol that matched the one on his chain. He pressed his palm against the wall, and the stone pulsed like a drumbeat, and a soft groan echoed through the shrine, and the ground shivered like something deep below had stirred in its sleep. And the girl took a step back and shouted at him to stop, but the priest turned to her with a strange sadness in his eyes and said it had already begun that night. The dreams came to many in the colony, and they were all the same, and in the dreams they saw the shrine burning with blue fire, and a voice speaking in many tongues. And in the dreams a figure walked through a field of broken stars, and behind him marched creatures made of bone and metal and light. And when the people woke, their beds were cold, and their hearts pounded like drums, and none of them spoke of what they saw. The elder of the colony gathered the council and said the human priest must leave or be destroyed, for he was the echo of an old fear, and his kind once turned whole worlds to ash with only words. And the council agreed, but none were brave enough to face him, and some said they should send the sky guards, and others said they should seal the shrine forever. But the elder only said one thing, and it was this: if he opens the book again, the sky will bleed. And so the decision was made in silence and fear, and the girl stood outside the council room, listening with tears in her eyes, and the wind whispered through the wires above, and somewhere far away thunder rumbled in a sky that held no clouds. The shrine was quiet as the sun rose behind the red hills, and light passed through broken windows like golden rivers that touched old stone and lit up the strange symbols still glowing from the night before. And the priest sat in the center of the room with the black book resting on his lap, and his eyes closed, as if he was waiting for something that had not yet arrived. The girl returned to the shrine with soft steps and careful eyes, and she did not speak as she entered, but the priest opened his eyes and looked at her with a calm face and said the book had called him again, and she asked why it listened to him when no one else could even hold it without feeling pain, and he said he did not know, but he had always dreamed of words that were not his own since he was a child. She walked closer and saw the book had opened on its own, and the pages moved like soft leaves blown by a silent wind, and the symbols upon them looked alive, shifting with purpose like they were choosing their own meaning, and she reached toward it, but pulled her hand back when the ink began to move, as if warning her to stay away. The priest told her about the dreams he had as a boy, about cities that burned without fire and voices that screamed, an empty space and doors that opened in the sky, and how every time he woke he would draw the symbols from his dreams in the dirt, and how once a woman who called herself a star watcher saw his marks and told him he was not meant for Earth. He remembered being afraid and running from what she said and hiding inside quiet churches where no machines worked right when he was near and candles lit on their own, and statues wept oil instead of wax, and people said he was blessed, but he never believed them and prayed harder every day, hoping the voices would go away. The girl listened and said nothing, and she asked him what the Star Watcher had meant, and the priest said she believed humans were once made to carry power not their own, and that long ago an ancient empire gave humans something called echo energy to use them as living tools to bend space and matter. And when humans started to change and grow stronger, the empire feared them and tried to erase all that power from the stars. The girl said her people had stories of such humans who walked like gods but died like beasts, and how their voices could twist time and make suns weep, and she never thought they were real until now. And she looked at the priest and saw the small marks glowing on his skin like fireflies under the surface, and asked if he truly was one of them. He said he did not know, but the book had only opened for him, and now it would not close. And when he read from it, the world began to move, as if his voice held a key to something that should have stayed locked. And she asked why he kept reading, and he said the book would not let him stop, and that each night he heard a voice from deep inside it, whispering a single word again and again: remember that. Evening, the sky over Dustfall turned a strange shade of violet, in the clouds circled above the shrine like smoke trapped in glass, and many of the aliens stayed indoors, while others watched from windows with fear in their eyes. And the priest stepped outside and spoke one line from the book, and the wind around the colony stopped moving, and a dead tree near the center of the square grew green leaves before their eyes. The council watched in secret, and one of the elders said, the human was not just a danger but a doorway, and if left unchecked, something old and deadly would come through. And the others nodded, but none moved to stop him, for they feared what might happen if he spoke again that night. The girl returned once more, and found the priest sitting at the back of the shrine where a hidden passage had opened in the stone, and inside was a small room filled with carvings and metal plates, and in the center stood a pedestal with a symbol that pulsed like a living it. And the book floated above it, spinning slowly without touch. The priest said the shrine was not just a place of worship, but a seal, and the book was its key, and now the seal had weakened, and whatever was held beneath might soon rise. And she asked what slept there, and he said he did not know, but it was older than her people, and perhaps older than the stars. She stepped forward and touched the edge of the floating book, and her fingers burned with light, and the shrine trembled, and the ground cracked, and far below something moved, and a sound rose through the stone-like breathing that had been silent for 1,000 years. The girl looked at the priest with wide eyes and asked what they had done, and he looked back and said something he had never said before. I remember now, the sky above. This fall was quiet, but the clouds had stopped moving, and the stars were no longer where they used to be, and some of the alien elders said the stars were holding their breath and waiting for something to fall in. Deep inside the shrine, the human priest stood before the open book and whispered words that had not been spoken in 10,000 cycles, and with each word the light in the room grew colder, not brighter, and the stone beneath his feet began to shift as if remembering its true shape. The girl stood outside the shrine and looked up at the strange color in the sky, and she saw that the moons had turned a faint red, and birds that flew too close to the shrine fell from the air without sound. And she turned and ran back into the shrine, shouting for the priest to stop, and when she reached him, the book snapped shut by itself, and the light vanished, but the damage had already been done. Far above the colony, a ripple moved through the clouds like something unseen brushing against the sky, and a deep boom echoed across the hills, though no storm followed, and then the power across full went out, and machines froze, and lights blinked once before fading, and in the temple of the elders the great crystal cracked down the middle, and its glow died with a long aliens rushed through the colony in panic, and some shouted that the end had come, and others cried for the sky to forgive them, and a few whispered the old name they had sworn never to speak, and one elder stood on the platform and pointed toward the shrine, and said the curse had awakened, and they must destroy the one who carried it. Before the world unraveled again, the priest sat inside the shrine, unmoving, and his eyes were wide and filled with light that shifted like water, and he whispered that something had awakened far below the stone, and that it was not alive in the way they knew life, but it had begun to listen, and it was hungry. And the girl asked what it wanted, and the priest said it wanted him, and it wanted the book, and it wanted to rise. The council sent soldiers in silver armor and glowing weapons, and ordered them to drag the priest from the shrine and to seal the place with fire and lock and prayer, and never open it again. And the girl heard this and ran to the gate to stop them, but they pushed her aside and marched forward with no fear in their hearts, and their steps shook the ground as they neared the cursed place. When they entered the shrine, the door closed behind them, and a wind screamed from deep within, and lights flashed through the cracks in the stone, and then silence followed. And not one soldier came back out, and the girl waited outside crying and calling their names, but only the wind answered her with a voice that was not her own. The elders said the human had killed them and must be destroyed. And one said he would call down fire from the sky-ships and end the shrine forever, but another said the human could not be killed like others, for he was not only flesh and blood now, and the girl said he was still just a man, and they must speak to him before doing anything worse inside the shrine. The priest opened his eyes and said the book had shown him what was sleeping below, and it was made of memory and shadow and light that had forgotten how to shine, and it was old before the stars were born, and it had once ruled through song and thought, and now it had only one desire, and that was to speak again through the voice of Manthe. Girl knelt before him and asked what she must do, and he looked at her with eyes full of sorrow, and said she could leave and live, or stay and be part of the end, and she said she would stay because someone must help carry the weight of what comes. And she took his hand, and the symbols on her skin began to glow like his, and the book opened by itself and turned to a page neither of them had ever seen. They began to read together, and the ground shook, and the altar split, and deep beneath the colony something opened its eyes, and a sound rose through the rocks, like a heartbeat that had not beaten in ages, and across the galaxy ancient sensors blinked to life, and lost machines whispered. One word into the void returned. The priest stood, and the light around him burned blue and gold, and the monsters below did not rise, yet but waited for the final call. And the girl looked up at him and said she believed in his voice, and he said he believed in hers, and the book rose into the air between them, and pages turned on their own, and fire danced in the air without heat or smoke. The girl stepped outside and saw the colony frozen in fear, and she raised her hand and said, the end had not come, but the beginning had, and those who wish to live must listen, not fight. And from that moment, the whispers in the wind grew louder and all across the hills. The stone began to sing in a language none had heard, but all could feel in their bones, and the stars above blinked as if watching closer now than ever before. The wind howled over Dustfall like a voice calling across time, and the sky was dark, even though no clouds covered the stars and inside the shrine. The priest and the girl stood near the broken altar with the book floating between them, and the air was thick with light that moved like smoke, and the symbols on the walls pulsed with rhythm like the beat of a heart that had been sleeping too long, and now remembered pain and power. The priest looked at the girl and said the book had shown him more, and each word he read pulled back a layer of silence from the past, and the truth was buried deep, not just under Dustfall, but under every lie the galaxy had told itself to forget. and he said the thing beneath the stone was only one part of a much older design, and he was not its master, but its echo, the girl said. Her people had stories about the first cycle, when stars were young, and voices moved between worlds without ships or wires, and when humans were brought into the stars by the old empire not as guests or allies, but as vessels and tools and weapons that could speak with power and break the laws of nature with words alone. And she said, those humans were feared and worshipped, and then hunted and erased. The priest nodded, and said he remembered pieces of it now, not from books or history, but from inside his blood and dreams. And he said, the name they used to call his kind was Voxy, which meant those who speak and shape, and that the old empire had made them with parts of broken gods and taught them to pray, not to honor, but to command, and that each command bent the world until it screamed he. Said his line had hidden for generations, using faith as a cage and churches as shelters, and his parents never told him what he was, but always warned him never to read old books, never to speak old names, and never to pray too loud in empty rooms, and he never knew why until the book called to him in a dream and led him to Dustfall, where the last echo slept. The girl touched the altar and said the shrine was built long after the war ended by those who wanted to forget and bury the last voice deep, where no ears could hear it. And she said her ancestors helped seal it because they were afraid it would return. And now it had, and it wore the shape of a man who did not want power but had it anyway, and she asked what would happen if the book finished its song. The priest looked at her and said the book was not just memory, it was a key and also a lock, and if the wrong words were spoken again, it could wake things that even the old empire feared. And she asked if he could stop it, and he said maybe not alone, and maybe not at all, but he had to try, 'cause if he stayed silent, the voices would rise without him and choose another who might not be so kind outside the shrine. The colony had changed, and some people fled into the wild lands, and others knelt and built small fires around the old tree that now grew fruit of light, and some whispered prayers to the priest calling him savior, and others cursed him, calling him the doom of stars, and the elders met in secret. One said they must contact the galaxy and warn the high voices, and another said they must end the girl before she fully changes. The girl knew what they were planning because the wind carried voices now, and the air around her spoke truths in broken whispers, and she told the priest, and he said her voice was starting to wake, and that was why the book listened to her too. And she asked if that meant she was now like him, and he said not like him, but something new and perhaps something stronger. They walked to the edge of the shrine where the ground had split and revealed the sealed chamber below, and light poured from the crack like mist, and inside they saw a shape floating in chains, made of song and glass and stone. And the girl stepped closer, and the shape opened its eyes and whispered one word that made her heart freeze. Welcome. The priest said that was the last guardian, the one who had once broken stars to stop the first war, and now waited for the voice to rise again. And if they freed it, they would not be able to stop what came next. And the girl looked into the glowing eyes of the thing and said, maybe it does not want to fight, maybe it wants peace. And the priest said, no curse ever wants peace. It only wants silence to end the book. Turned another page without touch, and the light around them pulsed like breath, and the chains on the guardian began to hum with tension, and from far beyond the sky, a signal echoed through space and was heard by old machines, forgotten in deep orbit, and their screens lit with red, and spoke one word that had not been seen since the Fulvoxian across the galaxy. Ancient eyes opened, and forces long buried began to stir, and Dustfall was no longer just a colony. It was now the center of a storm that would either save or shatter the future. And the girl and the priest stood together, knew there was no going back, and the book burned with words that had waited too long to be spoken again. Asterisk the sky above. Dustfall cracked with red light, and the clouds spun like torn cloth, while the wind carried voices that did not belong to any living thing, and the people of the colony stayed in their homes with doors shut and eyes full of fear, and the machines across the hills flickered and shook as if trying to run from something. Deep beneath the ground inside the shrine, the priest stood near the edge of the broken floor where the light from the chamber below rose like fog, and the girl stood beside him, with her hand pressed to the open book, and the pages moved without sound, and the symbols no longer shifted but held steady like they had chosen what they wished to be, and the light that poured from them was no longer soft or warm, but sharp like blades made of memory below. The shrine, the chained guardian, opened its eyes again, and its body, twisted like shadow wrapped in stone in its chains, began to crack and sing with a sound that made the walls weep, and the stone dripped tears of red, and the girl heard a name whispered from the creature's mouth, and it was her own, and she stumbled backward with her heart pounding and her breath caught in her throat. The priest pulled her back and told her that chains would not hold forever, and the book had shown him what was to come, and the guardian was not a monster, but a doorway, and if it walked free, then everything that slept beyond would follow, and he said it would not listen to anyone except one who carried the voice, and now that she had spoken the words. The book had chosen her too. The girl said she did not want that, and the priest said no one ever did, and power was never a gift, it was a weight, and the book had been waiting not for him but for her, and he was only the key to lead it to her voice and the moment. She touched the page and heard the name. It had already begun, and nothing could stop the awakening now. Colony Council gathered in secret and sent a signal to the high voices far beyond the stars, and they begged for fire to be sent to burn the shrine and end the human and the girl before the storm could rise, but no answer came, and their screens filled with static and strange symbols, and then silence, and one elder said it was already too late, and the curse had already stepped into the world again. In the sky a tear opened for one moment, and those who looked saw shapes behind the stars, and strange machines watching with dead eyes, and the animals of Dustfall fled in every direction as if the world itself, Bet, had begun to scream, and the old tree at the center of the colony bloomed with fruit that bled light and vines that wrapped around nearby buildings without warning. Inside the shrine, the book floated higher, and the air turned thick and heavy, and each breath burned with power. And the girl took the priest's hand and asked what she must do, and he said the words she speaks. Next, we'll either open the door or seal it forever, but if she chooses silence, then something else will speak in her place, and it will not ask for peace. She closed her eyes and began to speak, not with fear, but with sorrow, and her voice was soft at first, but grew louder with each word, and the shrine shook, and the ground split further, and the guardian below roared not in rage but in welcome, and the chains broke one by one, and light poured upward like a river of shattered stars. The people of the colony fell to the ground as a wave of energy swept through the land, and their minds filled with images of war and ruin and fire, and then peace and rebirth, and a voice that promised both hope and horror in equal measure. And many wept, and many screamed, and a few smiled with wide, unblinking eyes. The girl stood glowing like a figure carved from light and shadow, and the book burst into flames that did not burn, and the priest knelt before her not as a servant, but as one who had waited a long time to find another who could carry the burden he could not, and the shrine rose into the air as if lifted by the breath of old gods, and the stars above blinked like waking eyes. The guardian climbed from the chamber and knelt before the girl and said the world was hers to speak into shape, and the army that had once followed the voice in the first age awaited beyond the veil, and the decision was hers, and the priest said she must choose not with power, but with heart, and the girl said she only wanted to protect the innocent and end the silence that had become a scream at that moment. Across the stars the ancient machines turned and listened, and the high voices fell quiet, and the oldest beings in the galaxy looked toward Dustfall not with anger or fear, but wonder, because the voice had returned not in rage, but in hope, and the song that had ended the first cycle was now being sung by one who did not seek a throne but peace. And far beyond the edge of known space, the forgotten war beasts stirred, and the planets of stone and ash turned once again, and the galaxy braced itself for the final word that would shape all that came next. And in the shrine that floated above the cracked world, the girl spoke that word, and the stars themselves leaned closer to hear it. Dustfall was no longer quiet, and the ground no longer still, and the skies held no peace as the shrine hovered above the colony, wrapped in gold and silver. Flames that did not burn, and all across the hills strange lights blinked and whispered, and machines long buried pulled themselves from the dust and turned toward the center where the voice had spoken and the curse had. Again the girl stood. In the heart of the shrine, with the book floating near her shoulder, and the guardian kneeling beside her, and her eyes glowed with symbols that shifted like stars in motion, and her skin carried light that pulsed with every heartbeat, and her voice had not spoken again since that last word, but the world had already begun to change with its echo, and nothing could go back to how it was before. The priest stood beside her with his robe torn and marked with ash and light. Still held the marks of power, he now looked smaller next to the one it guided and awakened, and he smiled with sadness and pride and said the story that had haunted his blood was now hers to carry, and she looked at him with quiet strength and said it would not be a curse if she could shape its path across. The colony, the people gathered in silence with their heads low and their bodies trembling as the energy washed over them again, and it felt like wind and fire and memory. And some fell to their knees in awe, and others turned away in fear, and still others whispered prayers to names they had forgotten until now, and the trees near the edge of the land grew taller in moments, and the rivers flowed backward for a breath. The council hall the elders watched, the shrine above them, and one shouted that the end had come, and another said, perhaps the beginning. And one of them wept as he held a scroll from his ancestors, which told of the day the voice would rise again and bring choice back to those who had forgotten how to choose, and none of them could agree on what would happen next, but none dared to act against it. A girl stepped forward, and the flames parted to make way for her, and the guardian followed without sound, and the priest walked behind them with his hands clasped, and the path below them lit with every step. And when they reached the edge of the shrine, the people looked up and saw not a destroyer, not a monster, but someone who had carried fire without letting it consume her, and the wind spoke her name without breath. She said the galaxy had lied to itself for too long and buried what it feared, and now it must listen again and understand that power without mercy becomes ruin, and silence without truth becomes rot, and that the voice was never meant to conquer, but to call and to bind and to guide. And she raised the book into the air, and its pages turned and burned and scattered. Like birds made of light, the stars above Dustfall shimmered as a signal passed between them, and ships far beyond the rim turned to face the colony with systems lighting up with old warnings and old songs, and ancient weapons that had not fired in lifetimes began to hum with power as they prepared for something they did not understand and could not stop. And the girl looked up and smiled without fear. The priest touched her shoulder and said this was the moment where fate would bend and the path would split, and what she spoke next would reach not only minds but the bones of the stars. And she asked if he would walk beside her, and he said always, and the guardian bowed and said the army of echoes now waited, and they would follow her voice to the edge of creation and beyond if she willed. Ichi looked at the people and raised her hand and said they had a choice to hide or to rise, and to follow or to fade, and that no one would force them, but the silence would not wait forever, and those who wished to live in the old world must face what slept beneath its skin, and those who walked forward must carry light that burned away lies. And she turned and walked down from the shrine with each step the ground healed, and the air shimmered, and the machines that once feared the book now sang in harmony with it, and the colony of Dustfall became a place of change, where the past was no longer buried, but spoken, and the future no longer feared but faced. And the girl, who once hid behind stone, now led the storm with a voice that could shape truth itself across the stars. The high voices fell silent as they listened, and one by one their towers blinked with symbols they thought lost, and worlds began to stir as memories woke in stone and steel and wind. And the walking curse was no longer a name of dread, but a story retold in new light and carried on new lips, and the galaxy would never forget again. So the girl walked with the priest and the guardian behind her, and the book floating by her side, and as she passed through the colony, the people bowed, not because of fear, but because they felt something pure and heavy in the air, like the beginning of a song that had waited too long to be heard in the stars. Leaned in once more to listen, as the voice spoke again and again and again.